The fluorescent lights in the Jefferson High School cafeteria cast harsh shadows across Emma Chen's face as she clutched her lunch tray with trembling fingers. What happened next would send shockwaves through the entire school district, land 3 students in juvenile court, and transform a quiet 16-year-old girl into an unlikely symbol of resilience. But it all started with something as simple as trying to order a slice of pizza without stumbling over the letter P before we jump back in. Tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Emma had always been the kind of student who preferred the safety of shadows to the glare of attention. Standing barely 5 feet tall with long black hair that she used like a curtain to hide behind, she moved through Jefferson High's crowded hallways like a ghost trying not to disturb the living. Her stutter had been with her since childhood, a neural hiccup that turned simple conversations into obstacle courses of blocked syllables and painful pauses. Most days, she managed to navigate around it, choosing her words carefully, speaking only when absolutely necessary, living in the quiet spaces between other people's noise. The Chen family had moved to Riverside, California just 2 years ago when Emma was 14. Her father, Dr. Michael Chen, had accepted a position at the University Medical Center, while her mother, Sarah, worked as a translator for the court system. They'd chosen Riverside specifically for its diversity, hoping their children would feel more at home than they had in their previous small town where Asian families were rare enough to draw stares at the grocery store. Emma's older brother Daniel, now 18 and a senior, had adapted quickly to their new environment. Where Emma shrank from attention, Daniel seemed to attract it effortlessly, though for different reasons than most teenagers. Daniel Chen was what teachers diplomatically called a focused student. While his sister struggled with social interaction, Daniel had found his passion early and pursued it with single-minded determination. At age 7, he'd begged their parents to enroll him in martial arts classes after watching a documentary about Bruce Lee. What started as a way to build confidence in a shy boy had evolved into something approaching obsession. Daniel trained 6 days a week at Master Kim's traditional Taekwondo Academy, where he'd earned his 2nd-degree black belt just 3 months after his 18th birthday. He competed in regional tournaments, taught classes to younger students, and had already been accepted to UC San Diego with a partial scholarship based on his athletic achievements. But for all his physical prowess, Daniel remained fiercely protective of his younger sister, perhaps because he understood what it felt like to be different. While Emma battled her stutter, Daniel had spent years overcoming his own challenges with anger management, channeling his intensity into disciplined training rather than destructive outlets. The siblings shared a bond forged by mutual understanding and quiet support. Emma attended every one of Daniel's tournaments, cheering silently from the stands, while Daniel helped her practice presentations for school, patiently listening as she worked through difficult words without ever showing frustration or pity. The trouble at Jefferson High had been building slowly, like pressure in a fault line before an earthquake. It started small, as these things often do, with sideways glances and whispered comments that Emma pretended not to hear. 3 students in particular seemed to take pleasure in her discomfort, though their motivations differed slightly. There was Marcus Rodriguez, a junior who'd transferred from a private school after disciplinary problems that his wealthy parents preferred not to discuss. Marcus had the kind of aggressive charisma that attracted followers and intimidated teachers, combined with enough intelligence to make his cruelty seem clever rather than merely mean. Then there was Jessica Walsh, a blonde junior who'd been homecoming princess the previous year and seemed to view high school as her personal kingdom. Jessica's bullying was more subtle than Marcus's, delivered with the kind of sugary smile that made adults think she was being helpful rather than harmful. She had perfected the art of asking innocent questions designed to trigger Emma's stutter, then expressing exaggerated concern about Emma's ability to communicate effectively. The third member of this toxic triangle was Kyle Patterson, a follower, who laughed too loud at Marcus's jokes and filmed too much of their daily interactions on his phone. Kyle was the type who might have been harmless on his own, but became dangerous when given an audience and a leader to impress. His contribution to Emma's torment was documentation, creating a digital record of her humiliation that could be shared and reshared with devastating efficiency. The pattern had established itself over the first month of the new school year. Emma would enter a classroom, cafeteria, or hallway and somehow find herself in the crosshairs of their attention. Marcus would make a comment designed to force her to respond. Jessica would ask a follow-up question with fake concern. Kyle would capture her stammering response on video, and the cycle would complete itself with laughter that followed her to her next class. Emma had developed elaborate strategies to avoid them, memorizing their schedules, taking circuitous routes between classes, eating lunch in the library instead of the cafeteria. But avoidance could only work for so long in a building with limited space and mandatory attendance. The confrontation that would change everything happened on a Tuesday in October, during what should have been the safest part of Emma's day. She'd arrived at the cafeteria early, hoping to get her lunch and find a quiet corner before the main crowd arrived. The lunch ladies knew her well by now, understanding her need for patience as she worked through her order. Mrs. Rodriguez, no relation to Marcus despite the shared surname, always smiled kindly and waited without showing impatience as Emma navigated the minefield of menu choices. Emma had been doing well that day, her speech flowing more smoothly than usual. She'd successfully ordered a turkey sandwich and was pointing to the pizza display when she heard the familiar sound of Marcus's voice behind her. Her shoulders tensed. Involuntarily, her breathing pattern shifting as anxiety flooded her system. She knew from experience that stress made her stutter worse, creating a cruel cycle where fear of stammering guaranteed that stammering would occur. The cafeteria was busier than she'd expected for the early lunch period. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Football players clustered around one table, their conversation loud and competitive. A group of theater kids had claimed their usual spot near the windows. Scripts spread between them as they ran lines for the upcoming production of Hamlet. Senior art students worked on college portfolio pieces, their sketch pads propped against lunch trays, while academic decathlon members huddled over textbooks, seizing every moment to study. Emma tried to focus on the friendly face of Mrs. Rodriguez, who was waiting patiently for her to specify which type of pizza she wanted. The words felt stuck in her throat, the P sound creating a roadblock that her tongue couldn't navigate around. She took a breath, tried again, and felt the familiar sensation of her speech mechanism jamming like a broken machine. Behind her, she heard Marcus's voice getting closer, Jessica's laugh joining his, and Kyle's distinctive snort that usually preceded the appearance of his phone camera. Mrs. Rodriguez leaned forward slightly, her expression encouraging rather than impatient. She'd worked in school cafeterias for 15 years and had seen every type of student struggle with every type of challenge. Emma's stutter didn't faze her any more than food allergies or dietary restrictions did. It was simply another accommodation that required patience and understanding. But the kindness in the lunch lady's eyes somehow made Emma's anxiety worse, adding the pressure of not wanting to disappoint someone who was being genuinely helpful. The P in pizza had become an insurmountable obstacle. Emma's mouth opened and closed soundlessly, her breathing shallow and rapid. She could feel heat rising in her cheeks, knew that her face was turning the telltale red that made her Asian features stand out even more dramatically against her flushed skin. Behind her, Marcus's voice carried clearly across the cafeteria. Noise, though he was speaking to his companions rather than directly to her. Marcus had perfected the art of indirect harassment, making comments that sounded casual to adult ears, but landed like precision strikes on their intended target. He'd learned that teachers and administrators were far less likely to intervene in conversations that weren't explicitly directed at the victim, giving him plausible deniability while still achieving his goal of public humiliation. This particular talent had kept him out of serious trouble at his previous school, despite multiple complaints from students and parents who couldn't quite prove that his behavior constituted bullying. The conversation behind Emma grew more pointed, Marcus's voice carrying just enough to ensure she could hear every word. He was discussing a hypothetical scenario involving someone who couldn't speak properly trying to order food, painting a picture of confusion and frustration that mirrored Emma's current situation with uncomfortable accuracy. Jessica's contributions were delivered in the tone of fake sympathy she'd perfected, expressing concern for people who couldn't communicate effectively and wondering aloud how they managed to function in normal social situations. Kyle's role in these performances was to provide an audience and amplification. His laughter was deliberately loud, designed to draw attention from other students and create a larger circle of witnesses to Emma's discomfort. He'd also begun the practice of filming these encounters, initially claiming he was just documenting his daily life for social media, but gradually focusing more specifically on moments when Emma was struggling to speak. These videos had started appearing on various platforms with captions that seemed supportive, but were actually mocking, describing Emma's speech difficulties in ways that invited ridicule disguised as concern. Emma's breathing had become even more irregular, her chest rising and falling in rapid, shallow movements that made speaking even more difficult. The harder she tried to force out the word pizza, the more elusive it became. Mrs. Rodriguez maintained her patient expression, but Emma could see the concern growing in her eyes. Other students in line were beginning to notice the delay, some checking their phones impatiently while others craned their necks to see what was causing the holdup. The word finally broke free in a cascade of repeated consonants that seemed to echo through the suddenly quiet section of the cafeteria. Emma's face burned with embarrassment as she managed to complete her order, pointing frantically at the cheese pizza to avoid having to say anything else. Mrs. Rodriguez served her quickly and kindly, adding an extra breadstick without being asked, a small gesture of solidarity that Emma appreciated even through her mortification. But the damage was done, and Marcus wasn't finished with his performance. As Emma turned from the lunch line with her tray, he stepped into her path with the casual confidence of someone who'd never faced real consequences for his actions. His smile was the kind that looked friendly to distant observers, but felt predatory up close, all teeth and no warmth. Jessica flanked him on one side, her expression a masterpiece of fake concern, while Kyle positioned himself for optimal filming angles. Marcus's opening move was deceptively simple, a basic greeting that seemed innocent enough to casual observers, but was loaded with potential for exploitation. He knew that forcing Emma to respond in public would trigger her stutter, and that her stammering response would provide entertainment for his growing audience. The beauty of his approach from his perspective was that it appeared social and friendly to any adults who might be watching. Teachers seeing the interaction from across the room would note a popular student making an effort to include a quiet classmate, not recognizing the calculated cruelty beneath the surface. Emma's response was exactly what Marcus had anticipated and hoped for. The combination of surprise, social anxiety, and the pressure of public attention created perfect conditions for her stutter to manifest at its worst. Her attempt to return his greeting became a stuttering loop that seemed to go on forever, each failed attempt to speak making the next attempt more difficult. The sound drew attention from nearby tables, creating an expanding circle of witnesses to her struggle. Jessica's contribution was perfectly timed and expertly delivered. She stepped forward with an expression of exaggerated concern, her voice carrying just the right note of helpful worry to sound genuine to casual listeners. Her question about whether Emma was okay was phrased in a way that required a verbal response, ensuring that the stammering would continue and intensify. Jessica had studied Emma's patterns carefully, understanding exactly which types of questions and situations triggered the most severe episodes. Kyle's phone was out now, capturing everything with the casual efficiency of someone who'd done this many times before. His filming technique had improved with practice, learning to position himself so that Emma's distress was clearly visible, while keeping Marcus and Jessica's faces mostly out of frame. This allowed him to share the videos later, while protecting his co-conspirators from identification, a strategic approach that had served them well in previous encounters. The scene was attracting more attention now, other students turning to watch the interaction with the mixture of curiosity and discomfort that always accompanied public displays of social awkwardness. Some looked genuinely concerned for Emma, while others seemed entertained by the spectacle. A few appeared uncomfortable with what they were witnessing, but uncertain about whether or how to intervene. The bystander effect was in full force, each potential helper assuming someone else would step forward if action was really necessary. Emma's distress was becoming more visible by the second, her face flushed red, and her breathing rapid and shallow. Her lunch tray shook in her hands, the plastic plate rattling softly against the tray's surface. She'd encountered situations like this before, but never with such a large audience or such persistent tormentors. Usually she could escape to a bathroom or empty classroom to recover her composure in private. Here, surrounded by curious faces and Kyle's recording phone, she felt trapped in her own malfunctioning speech patterns. Marcus was building toward his crescendo now, his comments becoming more pointed while maintaining the veneer of friendly concern that protected him from immediate consequences. He began offering helpful suggestions for Emma's communication difficulties, recommendations delivered with fake sincerity that made them even more cutting than direct insults would have been. He suggested speech therapy, special education classes, and alternative communication methods, each suggestion accompanied by Jessica's enthusiastic agreement and Kyle's amplifying laughter. The suggestions were designed to be particularly humiliating because they contained just enough truth to sting. Emma had attended speech therapy as a child, though she'd stopped when the family moved to Riverside. She did sometimes use written communication to avoid verbal interaction, and she had occasionally wondered if she qualified for special accommodations. Having these private struggles exposed and mocked in public felt like emotional surgery performed without anesthesia. Other students were beginning to take sides now, some laughing along with Marcus's performance while others looked increasingly uncomfortable with the prolonged nature of the harassment. A few whispered among themselves, debating whether to intervene or find a teacher, but the diffusion of responsibility kept anyone from taking decisive action. Everyone assumed someone else would handle the situation if it really got out of hand, not recognizing that it had already crossed the line from social awkwardness into active cruelty. Emma's breathing had become so rapid and shallow that she was beginning to feel lightheaded, her vision starting to blur around the edges. The combination of hyperventilation and acute stress was creating a feedback loop that made speech even more impossible. Her attempts to respond to Marcus's questions became increasingly desperate and unsuccessful, each failure adding to her humiliation and making the next attempt more difficult. Mrs. Rodriguez had noticed the commotion from behind the lunch counter and was beginning to look concerned, but the interaction was taking place far enough from her station that she couldn't clearly hear what was being said. From her perspective, it looked like a group of students having an animated conversation, not recognizing the predatory dynamic at play. The acoustics of the cafeteria, combined with the general noise level, made it difficult for adults to distinguish between normal social interaction and harassment unless they were specifically looking for warning signs. Marcus was approaching the climax of his performance now, having built the audience's attention and maximized Emma's distress. His final gambit was the cruelest yet, a suggestion that Emma might be better suited to a school with special programs for students with communication disorders. The recommendation was delivered with such apparent sincerity that it sounded almost reasonable to uninformed listeners, but Emma understood the implication clearly. She was being told, in front of dozens of her peers, that she didn't belong at Jefferson High School. Jessica's enthusiastic agreement with Marcus's suggestion added another layer of humiliation, her bright smile and encouraging tone making the cruelty seem like genuine helpfulness. She began elaborating on the benefits of specialized education, describing programs designed for students who couldn't function in mainstream academic environments. Her detailed knowledge of these options suggested she'd researched the topic specifically for the purpose of this moment, turning Emma's legitimate educational needs into weapons for public humiliation. Kyle's filming had become more obvious. Now his phone held at eye level to capture every moment of Emma's breakdown. He'd learned from previous encounters that the most shareable content came from moments of peak distress, when Emma's stutter was at its worst and her emotional state most fragile. These videos performed well on social media platforms, generating likes and shares from viewers who found entertainment in another person's suffering. The audience around them had grown larger as word of the spectacle spread through the cafeterias. Social networks. Students from other tables had begun drifting over, drawn by the combination of drama and schadenfreude that made public humiliation so compelling to teenage observers. The circle of witnesses now included members of every major social group in the school, from athletes to academics to artists, all united in their role as consumers of Emma's distress. Emma's vision was tunneling now, the edges of her sight going dark as hyperventilation combined with overwhelming stress to create a perfect storm of physiological dysfunction. Her lunch tray had begun shaking so violently that the items on it were starting to slide around, the plastic cup of water threatening to spill across the food. Her attempts to speak had devolved into wordless gasping, her mouth opening and closing soundlessly as her speech mechanisms shut down completely under the assault of anxiety and attention. The sound that finally emerged from Emma's throat wasn't words at all, but a strangled sob that cut through the cafeteria noise like a knife through silk. The raw pain in that sound created a moment of uncomfortable silence among the watching students, some of them finally recognizing that they were witnessing genuine suffering rather than mere social awkwardness. But the moment passed quickly, filled by Marcus's immediate commentary about emotional instability and Jessica's concerned questions about whether Emma needed medical attention. Kyle zoomed in for a close-up of Emma's face, capturing the tears that had begun streaming down her cheeks and the desperate, trapped expression in her eyes. This was the money shot he'd been waiting for, the moment of complete breakdown that would generate the most engagement when shared online. His experience had taught him that videos showing genuine emotional distress performed significantly better than those featuring mere embarrassment, tapping into viewers' darker impulses, while maintaining plausible deniability about the content's harmful nature. The lunch tray finally slipped from Emma's shaking hands, crashing to the floor with a sound that seemed unnaturally loud in the packed cafeteria. The plastic plate shattered, sending pieces of food across the linoleum floor, while the cup of water exploded in a spray that reached several nearby students. The crash drew attention from across the entire cafeteria, including staff members who had previously been occupied with their own duties. Mrs. Rodriguez was moving now, coming around the lunch counter with the determined stride of someone who'd seen enough and was prepared to take action. Her 15 years of experience had taught her to recognize the difference between normal teenage drama and genuine distress, and Emma's collapse crossed clearly into the latter category. But she was still several steps away, navigating through the crowd of students who'd gathered to watch the spectacle. Marcus seized the moment of maximum chaos to deliver his final blow, a comment about Emma's inability to function in normal social situations that was perfectly timed to coincide with her public breakdown. His words carried clearly across the suddenly quiet section of cafeteria, ensuring that everyone present would remember this moment as confirmation of his assessment. Jessica nodded sagely, adding her own observations about the challenges faced by students who couldn't communicate effectively. Emma dropped to her knees beside the scattered remains of her lunch, her shoulders shaking with silent sobs as the full weight of her humiliation crashed over her. The physical collapse seemed to satisfy something in the watching crowd, providing a dramatic conclusion to the spectacle they'd been consuming. Some students began pulling out their own phones to capture the aftermath, while others finally looked uncomfortable enough to consider intervention. Kyle continued filming throughout Emma's breakdown, recognizing that her complete emotional collapse would provide the most compelling content for his social media audience. His commentary for the video was delivered in the tone of concerned observation, describing the scene as if he were a neutral documentarian rather than an active participant in creating the situation. This narrative framework would allow him to share the content later, while maintaining the fiction that he was simply recording events rather than orchestrating them. The circle of students around Emma had grown even larger now, drawn by the dramatic conclusion to the harassment campaign they'd been witnessing. The crowd included faces from every grade level and social group, united in their role as spectators to another person's suffering. Some looked genuinely distressed by what they were seeing, while others appeared entertained by the drama. Most fell somewhere in between, uncomfortable with the situation, but uncertain about how to respond appropriately. Mrs. Rodriguez finally reached the center of the disturbance, her voice cutting through the crowd noise with the authority of someone accustomed to managing chaotic situations. Her first priority was Emma's immediate welfare, kneeling beside the distraught girl and speaking in low, soothing tones designed to provide comfort and stability. Her second priority was dispersing the crowd of onlookers using the firm but patient voice she'd perfected for managing teenage audiences. Marcus attempted to maintain his helpful facade even as Mrs. Rodriguez took control of the situation, offering to assist with cleanup and expressing concern for Emma's well-being. His performance was seamless, switching from predator to good Samaritan, without missing a beat. Jessica matched his energy perfectly, her worried questions about Emma's condition delivered with such apparent sincerity that they sounded genuine to anyone who hadn't witnessed the preceding harassment. Kyle was more focused on preserving his documentation than maintaining appearances, discreetly attempting to continue filming while Mrs. Rodriguez's attention was focused on Emma. His phone captured the lunch lady's gentle attempts to comfort the sobbing girl, footage that would later be edited to support whatever narrative served his purposes best. The video evidence of adult intervention could be used to demonstrate that the situation had been properly handled, deflecting criticism of his role in creating it. Emma remained on the cafeteria floor, surrounded by the debris of her scattered lunch and the circle of curious faces that showed no signs of dispersing despite Mrs. Rodriguez's efforts. Her sobs had quieted to irregular gasps, but her distress remained clearly visible to anyone who cared to look. The combination of hyperventilation and emotional overwhelm had left her feeling disconnected from her surroundings, as if she were watching the scene unfold from outside her own body. The aftermath was unfolding exactly as Marcus had planned, with Emma thoroughly humiliated and his own reputation enhanced among the student audience who'd witnessed his performance. His calculated cruelty had achieved its intended effect while maintaining enough plausible deniability to protect him from serious consequences. From his perspective, the operation had been a complete success, providing entertainment for his followers while establishing his dominance in the school's social hierarchy. Jessica was already beginning to craft the narrative that would protect their group from accountability, expressing heartfelt concern about Emma's obvious need for professional support and wondering aloud whether the school's guidance counselors were adequately equipped to handle such severe communication disorders. Her comments were designed to frame Emma's breakdown as evidence of pre-existing problems rather than the result of deliberate harassment, shifting blame away from their actions and onto Emma's inherent limitations. Kyle's video documentation would prove crucial in supporting whatever version of events best served their interests, providing edited footage that could be interpreted multiple ways depending on the audience and context. His experience with social media manipulation had taught him that narrative framing was more important than objective truth, and that compelling content could be crafted from almost any raw material given sufficient creativity and editing skill. But none of them had anticipated the chain of events that their cruelty would set in motion, or the person who would soon become aware of what had happened to Emma in that crowded cafeteria. Daniel Chen was currently in his AP physics class, solving complex equations with the same focused intensity he brought to martial arts training, completely unaware that his sister was experiencing the worst moment of her high school career just 2 buildings away. The bell signaling the end of lunch period would ring in just 8 minutes, and with it would come a sequence of discoveries and revelations that would transform this moment of private suffering into something much larger and more consequential. Emma's public humiliation was about to become the catalyst for a reckoning that would reach far beyond the walls of Jefferson High School's cafeteria, touching lives and changing futures in ways that none of the participants could possibly imagine. Mrs. Rodriguez was helping Emma to her feet now, her gentle hand steady and supportive as the girl struggled to regain her composure. The lunch lady's years of experience had taught her that teenage crises often looked more dramatic than they actually were, but Emma's distress seemed deeper and more genuine than typical adolescent drama. Something about the calculated nature of the harassment she'd witnessed, combined with the crowd's eager consumption of the spectacle, suggested that this incident was part of a larger pattern of systematic cruelty. The crowd of student spectators was finally beginning to disperse as the novelty of the situation wore off and the approach of the next class period demanded their attention. But the damage had been done, and the ripple effects of Emma's public breakdown would continue spreading through the school's social networks long after the cafeteria had emptied. Videos would be shared, stories would be told, and reputations would be altered based on what had transpired in those crucial minutes when cruelty masqueraded as entertainment. Emma's journey back to emotional stability would be longer and more difficult than simply cleaning up spilled food and broken plastic. The psychological impact of such public humiliation would linger for days, weeks, perhaps months, affecting her ability to participate in classroom discussions, social interactions, and the basic activities of daily life that most students took for granted. The damage inflicted by Marcus, Jessica, and Kyle extended far beyond the immediate moment, creating wounds that would take considerable time and support to heal. But healing would come, though not in the way anyone expected. The forces that would drive Emma's recovery were already in motion, triggered by events that had yet to unfold, but were as inevitable as physics and as powerful as the protective instincts of an older brother who had dedicated his life to the disciplined pursuit of justice. The story that had begun with cruelty in a high school cafeteria was about to become something else entirely, something that would test the boundaries of family loyalty, personal honor, and the consequences that followed when predators finally encountered someone capable of matching their aggression with superior skill and unwavering determination. The transformation was coming, as certain as the changing of seasons and as dramatic as the difference between prey and predator. Emma's tormentors had chosen their victim carefully, selecting someone they perceived as weak and defenseless, someone whose suffering could be consumed without consequence. But they had made one crucial miscalculation in their assessment of the situation, an oversight that would soon prove to be their undoing. They had forgotten about Daniel. The bell that ended lunch period rang across Jefferson High with its usual mechanical indifference, but the sound carried different meanings for different people that Tuesday afternoon. For most students, it meant the reluctant transition from social time to academic obligation. For Emma Chen, still trembling in the nurse's office where Mrs. Rodriguez had escorted her, it meant temporary sanctuary from the curious stares and whispered conversations that would inevitably follow her. For days, for Marcus Rodriguez, Jessica Walsh, and Kyle Patterson, dispersing with satisfied smirks toward their respective fifth-period classes. It meant the successful conclusion of their most elaborate performance yet. But for Daniel Chen, walking briskly from a P-Physics toward his advanced chemistry lab, the bell meant nothing more than the rhythm of another ordinary school day. He moved through the crowded hallway with the fluid grace that came from years of martial arts training, his backpack slung over one shoulder, and his mind already focused on the molecular structures they'd be studying that afternoon. Daniel had always been good at compartmentalizing, a skill that served him well both in academic settings and competition environments where distractions could mean the difference between victory and defeat. The first hint that something was wrong came from Sarah Martinez, a sophomore who attended the same Taekwondo academy where Daniel taught evening classes. She approached him hesitantly near the chemistry building, her usual confident demeanor replaced by obvious discomfort. Sarah had been in the cafeteria during Emma's breakdown, positioned close enough to witness the entire sequence of events, but far enough away to avoid direct involvement. Like many of the other students present, she'd been frozen by the bystander effect, wanting to help but uncertain how to intervene effectively in such a volatile situation. Sarah's account was fragmented and emotional, delivered in the rushed tones of someone trying to convey urgent information while simultaneously processing their own guilt about remaining passive during a crisis. She described seeing Emma surrounded by older students, hearing laughter that didn't sound friendly, and watching as the situation escalated beyond normal teenage social dynamics into something that felt deliberately cruel. Her description of Emma's final breakdown was particularly difficult to deliver, the memory of her friend's distress clearly weighing heavily on her conscience. Daniel's initial reaction was confusion rather than alarm. Emma hadn't mentioned any problems at school beyond the usual challenges of adjusting to a new environment and managing her speech difficulties in academic settings. She'd seemed tired lately, perhaps a bit more withdrawn than usual, but nothing that suggested she was experiencing active harassment or systematic bullying. The disconnect between Sarah's dramatic account and his perception of Emma's daily experience created a cognitive dissonance that his mind struggled to resolve. The second confirmation came from an unexpected source. Marcus Thompson, a junior who worked part-time at the same medical clinic where Daniel volunteered on weekends, intercepted him outside the chemistry lab with information that painted a much clearer picture of what had occurred. Marcus had been eating lunch at a table with clear sightlines to the incident and had watched the entire confrontation unfold from beginning to end. Unlike Sarah, who'd been emotionally involved as Emma's friend, Marcus provided a more detached but comprehensive account of the systematic nature of the harassment. Marcus's description included details that Sarah had either missed or been too upset to articulate clearly. He described the calculated way the three bullies had positioned themselves to maximize Emma's discomfort while maintaining plausible deniability about their intentions. He mentioned Kyle's persistent filming and the way the crowd had been encouraged to participate as spectators rather than interveners. Most importantly, he revealed that this wasn't an isolated incident, but appeared to be the culmination of a campaign that had been building for weeks. The third piece of information came from Daniel's phone, where a text message from his mother indicated that Emma had called home sick and been picked up by Mrs. Rodriguez shortly after lunch period. The message was brief and matter-of-fact, but the timing confirmed that whatever had happened in the cafeteria had been serious enough to require parental intervention and early dismissal from school. Daniel's parents weren't the type to overreact to minor social difficulties, which meant Emma's distress must have been severe enough to warrant immediate attention. Daniel found himself standing outside the chemistry lab as other students filed past him into the classroom, his mind racing to process the implications of what he'd learned. The protective instincts that had been cultivated through years of martial arts training were beginning to activate, triggering physiological responses that he recognized from competition settings. His breathing had become more controlled and deliberate. His posture had shifted into a more balanced stance, and his awareness of his surroundings had sharpened to the hyper-vigilant state that preceded physical confrontation. The decision to skip chemistry class wasn't made consciously so much as it emerged from the collision between his growing anger and his need for immediate action. Daniel had never been the type of student who violated school rules casually, but the traditional boundaries of appropriate behavior seemed inadequate to address the situation that was unfolding. His sister had been systematically tormented while he remained obliviously focused on his own academic and athletic pursuits, and the guilt of that failure was rapidly transforming into something more dangerous. Daniel's first stop was the nurse's office, where he hoped to find Emma and assess her condition firsthand. The office was empty except for Nurse Patricia Williams, a middle-aged woman who'd worked at Jefferson High for over a decade and had seen every type of teenage crisis imaginable. She was completing paperwork related to Emma's early dismissal when Daniel arrived, his usually calm demeanor replaced by obvious agitation that immediately caught her attention. The conversation with Nurse Williams provided additional context about Emma's condition when she'd arrived at the office. The nurse described a level of distress that went far beyond typical social embarrassment, noting symptoms that suggested genuine trauma rather than mere teenage drama. Emma's hyperventilation had required intervention to prevent her from losing consciousness, and her emotional state had been so fragile that she'd been unable to provide a coherent account of what had happened. The nurse's professional assessment was that Emma had experienced something significantly more severe than a simple social misunderstanding. Daniel's request to see the incident report was denied due to privacy regulations, but Nurse Williams was able to confirm that multiple students had been present during whatever had occurred in the cafeteria. She also mentioned that Mrs. Rodriguez had expressed serious concerns about the behavior she'd witnessed, describing it as deliberate and systematic rather than accidental or spontaneous. The lunch lady's account had been detailed enough to include specific names and actions, suggesting that the harassment had been both obvious and prolonged. The walk from the nurse's office to the main administrative building gave Daniel time to consider his options and plan his approach. His martial arts training had taught him the importance of strategy and preparation, emphasizing that successful confrontation required more than mere physical capability. He needed information about the students involved, their schedules, their usual locations, and their social connections before he could determine the most effective way to address the situation. Rushing into confrontation without adequate intelligence would be counterproductive and potentially dangerous. The administrative office buzzed with the typical afternoon activity of a large high school, secretaries managing phone calls and paperwork while assistant principals dealt with the endless stream of disciplinary issues and scheduling conflicts that defined their daily existence. Daniel's reputation as a model student and accomplished athlete gave him credibility with the staff, but his current state of barely controlled anger was obvious enough to draw concerned attention from everyone who encountered him. Assistant Principal Jennifer Hayes had known Daniel since his family's arrival at Jefferson High 2 years earlier. She'd been impressed by his academic performance and leadership qualities, often citing him as an example of the type of student the school hoped to attract and retain. Her surprise at seeing him in the office during class time was obvious, as was her growing concern as she recognized the intensity radiating from his usually composed demeanor. Daniel's request for information about the cafeteria incident was professionally deflected, but her willingness to listen suggested that she took his concerns seriously. The conversation with Assistant Principal Hayes revealed several important facts about the school's awareness of ongoing social dynamics among the student body. Marcus Rodriguez, Jessica Walsh, and Kyle Patterson were known quantities in the administrative database, with histories that included previous complaints about their behavior toward other students. However, the complaints had been difficult to substantiate due to sophisticated nature of their harassment techniques and their ability to maintain plausible deniability when confronted by authority figures. Daniel learned that Emma had never filed an official complaint about harassment, which wasn't surprising given her reluctance to draw attention to herself and her difficulty with verbal communication in stressful situations. The absence of formal documentation meant that the administration had been unaware of the systematic nature of the problems she'd been experiencing, treating today's incident as an isolated event rather than the culmination of an ongoing campaign. This bureaucratic blindness frustrated Daniel, but also provided him with information about the gaps in the school's protective systems. The meeting with Assistant Principal Hayes concluded with promises of investigation and appropriate disciplinary action, but Daniel recognized the limitations of institutional responses to problems that operated in the gray areas between policy violations and criminal behavior. The school's hands were tied by due process requirements and the need for documented evidence, while the perpetrators had specifically chosen tactics that were difficult to prove and easy to dismiss as misunderstandings or accidents. The system that was supposed to protect students like Emma was structurally incapable of addressing the sophisticated cruelty she'd experienced. Daniel's frustration with administrative limitations was compounded by his growing understanding of the scope and duration of Emma's suffering. The systematic nature of the harassment suggested that it had been planned and coordinated, with each participant playing a specific role in maximizing her distress while minimizing their own exposure to consequences. The 3 students involved weren't casual bullies responding to opportunity, but rather calculating predators who'd identified a vulnerable target and developed effective strategies for exploitation. The discovery of Kyle's social media activity provided the final piece of the puzzle that Daniel needed to understand what his sister had been enduring. Through connections with other students who followed Kyle's various accounts, Daniel was able to access videos and posts that documented multiple incidents of harassment targeting Emma and other vulnerable students. The content was edited and presented in ways that made the victims appear foolish or unstable while portraying their tormentors as concerned observers documenting concerning behavior. Kyle's digital documentation revealed a pattern of predatory behavior that extended far beyond Emma's case. Multiple students appeared in his content, usually during moments of distress or vulnerability that had been deliberately provoked by Marcus and Jessica's harassment techniques. The videos were carefully edited to remove context and frame the situations as evidence of the victim's inadequacies rather than documentation of systematic cruelty. The comment sections were filled with mockery and dehumanizing language that transformed real people suffering into entertainment content. The sophistication of the operation impressed Daniel even as it horrified him. These weren't typical teenage bullies acting on impulse, but rather organized predators who developed effective systems for identifying targets, provoking reactions, documenting responses, and distributing content while maintaining legal and social protection for themselves. Their methods showed clear understanding of institutional limitations and social media algorithms, suggesting either unusual intelligence or previous experience with similar campaigns. Daniel's analysis of the evidence revealed several vulnerabilities in their operational security that could be exploited by someone with adequate motivation and capability. Kyle's documentation obsession had created a comprehensive record of their activities that could be used against them if properly leveraged. Marcus's need for social validation had led him to boast about their successes in ways that could be traced and verified. Jessica's carefully maintained image of concerned helpfulness was contradicted by her consistent presence during harmful incidents, creating patterns that suggested coordination rather than coincidence. The decision to take direct action crystallized as Daniel walked through the parking lot toward his car after school ended. The institutional response would be slow, bureaucratic, and ultimately insufficient to address the scope of the problem or prevent future incidents. Emma's suffering would continue while investigations proceeded and policies were reviewed and disciplinary committees deliberated. Meanwhile, Marcus, Jessica, and Kyle would have time to adjust their tactics, destroy evidence, and potentially target other vulnerable students who lacked protective siblings. Daniel's martial arts training had taught him that there were situations where formal authority was inadequate to address genuine threats, circumstances that required personal intervention despite official disapproval. Master Kim had emphasized that true martial artists had obligations that extended beyond tournament competition and demonstration performances, responsibilities to protect those who couldn't protect themselves and confront injustice, even when doing so involved personal risk. The principles that guided his training were clear about the necessity of action when institutional systems failed to provide adequate protection. The first challenge was locating his targets in a way that wouldn't alert school security or create public disturbances that could result in his own suspension or arrest. Daniel needed to isolate each of them individually, away from witnesses and authority figures, in settings where honest conversations could occur without interference or misinterpretation. His knowledge of the school's physical layout and daily rhythms, combined with information gathered from other students about his target's hand schedules, would be crucial for creating the necessary opportunities. Marcus Rodriguez typically remained after school for drama club rehearsals, which met in the theater building's basement studio 3 days per week. The location was relatively isolated from main administrative areas and had limited surveillance coverage due to budget constraints and the building's age. The rehearsal schedule was publicly posted, making it easy for Daniel to determine when Marcus would be available and approximately how long he'd be occupied with legitimate activities before becoming accessible for private conversation. Jessica Walsh's routine was more complicated, but equally predictable. She participated in student government activities that met in various locations, depending on the specific committee or project being addressed. Her social media activity provided detailed information about her daily schedule, including after-school appointments and extracurricular commitments that could be used to predict her location and availability. Her tendency to document her activities extensively would actually work against her in this context, providing Daniel with intelligence that would be impossible to gather through direct observation. Kyle Patterson presented the most interesting tactical challenge because his documentation obsession meant that any confrontation would likely be recorded and potentially shared online. However, his habit of filming others while they were distressed or vulnerable suggested that he'd never been the subject of serious intimidation himself. His confidence in remaining behind the camera rather than in front of it indicated a level of personal security that was about to be severely tested. Daniel's plan required careful timing and precise execution to achieve maximum effect while minimizing his own exposure to disciplinary consequences. Each confrontation would need to be brief, private, and focused on specific behavioral changes rather than general intimidation. The goal wasn't revenge, which would be emotionally satisfying but ultimately counterproductive, but rather the establishment of clear boundaries and consequences that would prevent future incidents involving Emma or other potential victims. The psychological aspects of the intervention were as important as the physical elements. Marcus, Jessica, and Kyle had operated with impunity because they'd never encountered serious opposition to their activities. Their confidence was based on the assumption that their victims would remain passive and that authority figures would remain ineffective. Confronting them with someone capable of matching their aggression while possessing superior physical capabilities would fundamentally alter the risk-reward calculations that guided their behavior. Daniel's approach would leverage the same psychological principles that his targets had used against Emma and others, turning their own tactics against them in ways that would be immediately recognizable and personally meaningful. The humiliation they'd inflicted on others would be reflected back at them, but in private settings where the damage to their reputations could be contained, if they chose to modify their behavior appropriately. The goal was behavioral modification through consequence demonstration rather than public destruction through exposure. The timing of the intervention was crucial for several reasons. Acting too quickly would prevent adequate preparation and intelligence gathering, while waiting too long would allow the targets to adjust their security or potentially target other victims. The optimal window was narrow but achievable if Daniel maintained focus and avoided the emotional reactions that could compromise his tactical advantages. His martial arts training had prepared him for exactly this type of high-stress situation, where discipline and strategy were more important than raw aggression. As Daniel sat in his car in the student parking lot, watching other teenagers head home to homework and after-school activities, he felt the familiar calm that preceded competition. His breathing had settled into the controlled rhythm that optimized both physical performance and mental clarity. His awareness had expanded to encompass every relevant detail of his environment, while filtering out distractions that could compromise his focus. The protective rage that had driven him throughout the afternoon was crystallizing into something more useful and directed. The transformation from concerned brother to tactical operator was complete. Emma's suffering had activated instincts and capabilities that Daniel had spent years developing, but had never been forced to deploy in real-world situations. The three students who'd systematically tormented his sister were about to discover that their actions had consequences they'd never anticipated, delivered by someone whose training and motivation made him uniquely qualified to provide the education they desperately needed. The lessons would begin immediately, and they would be memorable. Marcus Rodriguez was reviewing his lines for the upcoming production when the theater basement door closed with unusual finality behind him. He'd been alone in the rehearsal space for 20 minutes, running through his monologue from Act 2. When footsteps echoed down the concrete stairs, the sound was different from the casual shuffle of other drama students or the hurried click of teachers' heels. These footsteps were measured, deliberate, carrying the weight of someone who moved with purpose and complete confidence in their physical capabilities. Daniel Chen appeared at the bottom of the stairs like a shadow given form, his presence immediately transforming the atmosphere in the small rehearsal space. Marcus had seen Daniel around school before, knew him by reputation as Emma's older brother and one of the top martial arts competitors in the state, but they'd never interacted directly. The recognition was instant and unsettling, particularly given the timing and the isolated location of their encounter. The conversation that followed was brief and extraordinarily educational. Daniel's voice carried the calm certainty of someone who'd never doubted his ability to enforce his will when necessary. He explained to Marcus that the systematic harassment of Emma would stop immediately and permanently. He described the evidence he'd collected, the witnesses he'd interviewed, and the consequences that would follow if the behavior continued. His tone remained conversational throughout, but the underlying message was as clear as the focused intensity in his eyes. Marcus attempted to maintain his usual facade of plausible deniability, suggesting that Daniel had misunderstood normal social interactions and was overreacting to teenage drama. The response was immediate and educational. Daniel's movement was too fast to follow clearly, but Marcus found himself pressed against the concrete wall with pressure applied to specific points on his shoulder and neck that created immediate and focused discomfort without leaving visible marks. The demonstration lasted exactly 3 seconds before Daniel stepped back, his expression unchanged but his point definitively made. The technical explanation that followed was delivered in the same calm tone Daniel used for tutoring younger martial arts students. He described the precise application of pressure to nerve clusters, the difference between pain compliance and actual injury, and the extensive training required to achieve such control and precision. Marcus learned that his current discomfort represented perhaps 1% of Daniel's actual capabilities, and that escalation remained entirely at Daniel's discretion based on Marcus's future choices regarding Emma's well-being. Marcus's capitulation was immediate and complete. His usual arrogance evaporated under the realization that he'd encountered someone operating in an entirely different category of capability and determination. The social dynamics that had protected him throughout his harassment campaign were irrelevant when facing someone who possessed both the skill and motivation to impose direct consequences regardless of administrative policies or social conventions. His agreement to leave Emma alone was delivered with the sincerity of genuine fear. Jessica Walsh's encounter occurred 30 minutes later in the student government office, where she was updating bulletin boards for the upcoming homecoming activities. Her surprise at Daniel's arrival was evident, though she attempted to maintain her practiced expression of helpful concern even as the door closed behind him with deliberate finality. The isolation was complete, with administrative staff having departed for the day and other student government members having finished their obligations earlier. Daniel's approach with Jessica was more psychological than physical, recognizing that her sophisticated cruelty required a different form of education. He presented her with a comprehensive analysis of her harassment techniques, describing the calculated nature of her fake concern and the systematic way she'd contributed to Emma's suffering. His detailed knowledge of her methods was disturbing in its accuracy, suggesting surveillance and analysis that she'd never suspected. The revelation of Kyle's video evidence proved particularly effective in dismantling Jessica's defensive strategies. Daniel had acquired copies of footage showing her coordinated efforts with Marcus, her deliberate questions designed to trigger Emma's stutter, and her satisfied expressions during moments of maximum distress. The documentation contradicted every aspect of her carefully maintained image as a concerned classmate trying to help someone with communication difficulties. Jessica's attempts to justify her behavior as misunderstood helpfulness were methodically dismantled through Daniel's presentation of evidence and witness statements. Her realization that her actions had been observed, documented, and analyzed by someone with both the intelligence to understand her methods and the capability to impose consequences created a level of vulnerability she'd never experienced. Her agreement to cease all contact with Emma was accompanied by genuine tears of fear and shame. Kyle Patterson's education began when he discovered that his phone had been remotely accessed and his video files copied by someone with sophisticated technical capabilities. The message waiting for him when he arrived home was simple and terrifying. Every piece of content featuring Emma or other victims had been preserved as evidence, along with metadata proving when and where each video had been recorded. His documentation obsession had become the instrument of his own accountability. The meeting with Daniel occurred in the parking lot behind Kyle's part-time job at a local electronics store, where privacy was guaranteed and witnesses were absent. Kyle's usual confidence behind the camera evaporated when faced with someone who understood exactly how his content had been created and distributed. The technical analysis of his editing techniques and posting patterns revealed a level of calculated cruelty that even Kyle hadn't fully recognized in himself. Daniel's demonstration of Kyle's phone vulnerability was particularly effective. Within minutes, he'd accessed Kyle's social media accounts, cloud storage, and personal files, proving that privacy was an illusion when facing someone with adequate motivation and technical skill. The realization that his digital life could be exposed and manipulated in the same way he'd targeted others created immediate behavioral modification through fear of reciprocal treatment. The deletion of Kyle's harassment content was performed under Daniel's direct supervision, ensuring that every video, photo, and post targeting Emma or other victims was permanently removed from all platforms and devices. Kyle's cooperation was enthusiastic and complete, driven by the understanding that his continued access to digital privacy depended entirely on Daniel's ongoing satisfaction with his behavior toward Emma. Within 72 hours of Daniel's interventions, the systematic harassment that had tormented Emma for weeks came to an abrupt and permanent end. Marcus, Jessica, and Kyle began displaying behaviors that suggested genuine fear of consequences, avoiding Emma completely and actively discouraging others from any negative interactions with her. The change was so dramatic that other students noticed the sudden shift in social dynamics without understanding the underlying cause. Emma's recovery was gradual but steady, facilitated by the complete absence of her tormentors and the growing support from classmates who'd previously remained passive observers. Her stutter began improving as her stress levels decreased, and her confidence slowly returned as she realized that the harassment had truly ended. The cafeteria became a safe space again, allowing her to focus on her studies without constant anxiety about social encounters. The ripple effects extended beyond Emma's immediate situation. Other vulnerable students noticed that the school's primary harassers had suddenly become much more cautious in their behavior, creating a safer environment for anyone who might have been targeted next. The unofficial network of protection that Daniel had established through targeted intervention proved more effective than institutional policies in maintaining appropriate social boundaries. Daniel returned to his normal routine of academic excellence and martial arts training, but with the quiet satisfaction that came from applying his skills to protect someone who mattered more than any tournament victory or academic achievement. His intervention had demonstrated that sophisticated cruelty could be countered by superior capability and unwavering determination when institutional systems proved inadequate. The three former harassers learned to navigate their remaining time at Jefferson High with the understanding that their actions carried consequences they'd never previously considered. Their education and accountability was complete and permanent, creating behavioral modification that extended far beyond their interactions with Emma to encompass their treatment of all vulnerable students. Emma's smile returned gradually, but when it did, it carried the confidence of someone who knew she was truly protected. Her stutter remained a challenge, but it was no longer weaponized against her by calculating predators who discovered that some prey had guardians willing and able to enforce appropriate boundaries through whatever means proved necessary. The hallways of Jefferson High remained the same, but the power dynamics had shifted permanently in favor of those who deserved protection rather than those who specialized in exploitation. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.